Today we're going to cover very quickly Chapter 1 in the American Pageant. It's a pretty broad range of time, and we're going to hit some of the highlights, some of the major civilizations that existed, and some more general things. I'll try to point out to you what's most important. You'll see that much of this, like the shaping of North America, how the continents separated and the different mountain ranges formed, you've done this before. It's nothing that you're going to be tested on, just something to kind of set the stage. Same thing with the peopling of the Americas. I'm sure you've talked about the land bridge before and how people came from Asia over into North and South and reached South America. I did underline the Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecs. Those are major civilizations that we'll be talking about, mainly because they did have those sophisticated civilizations, which are very different from what we'll see in other areas of North America. In terms of the earliest Americans, one thing to keep in mind here is this cultivation of maize. Maize is a type of corn, and once people learn how to grow that, they're able to lay that foundation and start farming and stay in one place longer than they were able to before. So this really is a game changer in terms of civilizations. And if you see here, I have this phase here is number 3. There's actually, that means there's 2 before them, which we don't really need to talk about, but just the fact that there were other time periods. We're not just jumping in here to 2,000 years prior to European contact. But for our purposes, that's what we really need to know, is that we're in the Southwest by 1200 BC. Sometimes you'll also see this as BCE, which is before the Common Era, or regular BC. And the Pueblo are here in the Southwest, and just some characteristics: irrigation, dams, terracing or terrace farming, which I'm sure you talked about in Global, and other hallmarks of more sophisticated societies. The rest of North America developed a little bit later, and you can see it's less developed than the Pueblo. What we see in North America is we don't have these concentrations of people like we see of the Aztec in Mexico. We see there's some examples, the Mound Builders, Hohokam, Anasazi. They do have some. They did have beans, maize, squash. I'm sure you've heard of those before, the Three Sisters farming, but not to the extent that we saw with the Aztec in Mexico. The next thing we're looking at are some differences between the natives that were living in the New World and the Europeans that are eventually going to come. When we look at this, we're going to be talking about the Spanish first in this chapter. And you can see here, there's no horses, no domesticated animals. So the natives were introduced to these things by the Europeans. So when the Europeans brought the horses over, that was a change for the Native Americans. And then showing the other way, we have corn and potatoes. Those are native to North America, North and South America. They did not have them in Europe. Just kind of like to point that out, especially with potatoes, because later when we talk about the Irish potato famine, this is something as a result of the contact or the encounter, like that we call it. The potatoes were brought over to Europe. Differences in land is something that's really important and probably something that you're familiar with, that while there were tribal boundaries, the tribe's members held the land in common. They didn't believe in private ownership, whereas in Europe, that was the primary source of wealth. Everything existed around owning land, which helps explain why some of the Europeans did branch out, because they felt there was no more land to be had. And then the last here is that social stratification was very limited. We do, of course, have some elders or some rulers in the Native American tribes, but nothing like we see in Europe, which was built around, especially during feudalism, around that ownership of land. Okay, the next piece just talks a little bit about the fact that the Spanish, the Portuguese, none of those were the first real discoverers, if you will, of the New World. We did have an attempt from Scandinavians in Newfoundland very early, but it was abandoned. And then the Christian Crusaders. This is really a turning point in the whole world, but especially for exploration and settlement, because the Crusades, you talked about this in Global, and that hallmark of, yes, fighting for the Holy Land was one aspect, but once the people do go to the Holy Land and experience things differently and want some of those spices or silks or other things to be had from the East, we had to start to look elsewhere for how to get them. The route over the land was long, and then once the Turks actually control much of it, we have to go through them as middlemen, and as all middlemen do, they take a cut, so it becomes expensive. And so this really is a big push for trying to find a different route to get those goods to bring them back and trade. Early exploration, we know, going into Africa and other places in Asia. Marco Polo wrote about China. He's a very interesting explorer because we actually have the writings that he left to tell us about his encounters, because again, one thing we'll look at when school starts is how much of this has to be constructed just from what people left behind. The Portuguese are known for kind of starting the exploration craze at this time because of their advancements in sailing, navigation, Prince Henry the Navigator. This is coming at a time when we're seeing more ambitious monarchs. We're seeing the solidification of more nation states with Louis in France, Henry VII, that's Henry I Tudor after the War of the Roses, Isabella of Castile, and Ferdinand of Aragon. They are uniting their nations and they're looking for ways to make them bigger. So the Portuguese with the better sailing vessels, all stuff again you talked about in global. But Spain is what we're really going to look at here, is that when Ferdinand and Isabella unite their kingdoms and make at least the beginning of a nation state in Spain, they are eager to beat out or outdo their Portuguese counterparts. And so, of course, we know that they are the ones who sponsor Columbus's voyages to the New World. I don't want to spend too much time on Columbus, certainly not one of my favorites. We do know that on October 12, 1492, I mentioned that his crew, Rodrigo, is actually the gentleman who sighted land, and then Columbus, when he reported it, took credit for it. They sighted the land on the first voyage. October 12th is Columbus Day today. He thought he reached the Indies. Again, all stuff that you know, the Columbian Exchange, all of this things that come after Columbus's voyages. And he took more than one voyage after the first one, trying to find more gold and anything of value to bring back to Europe to justify his expense to especially Isabella and Ferdinand. And here I just put a nice diagram of the Columbian Exchange. This is really important as a turning point in the development of the world because of the introduction. We talked about some of this before. Here's those livestock that were unknown for the natives, but once they come in, that transforms a lot of what the natives are able to do in the Americas. Then you see the things going out. We mentioned the potatoes, corn, pumpkin, squash, all of those things are native. Unfortunately, this here is also something to look at. The Europeans unintentionally brought many of these diseases, as you can see listed here, with them. They carried the antibodies and then spread them to the natives who, since they never encountered them before, died off quite rapidly, which is unfortunate, but was actually kind of fortunate for especially the English later because it left land ready to be planted. Okay, and so the rest of this chapter focuses on really the Spanish experience, and it's kind of interesting because they do come before the English, but we spend most of our time talking about the English because they settle what we know as the United States today. But you do have to take a look at the differences, how the Spanish approached colonization differently from the English. And so we mentioned a couple, and I'm not going to go through those here, but rather the fact that the Spanish were looking for money. That is their main objective here, is that they want to find gold. And they do find some gold, especially Cortez when he goes into the Aztec Empire. And you can see here by this gold increases capitalism. We create a banking system, and it's another game changer for the Europeans, which then encourages more Europeans to come looking for the same thing. They use the Caribbean as a basis for a jumping off point to the mainland or to North and South America, because if you remember, Columbus landed in Hispaniola, not right on the mainland. And it is a testing ground for what will develop called the encomienda system, which is a plantation system that the Spanish will exploit. So Cortez does come into Mexico. He does have interpreters, so he's able to talk with the natives that are there. Not too much. I don't want to talk too much about his experience, except for the fact that he was allowed into the capital. They thought that he was this god, and he was able to overtake then an entire civilization. And the Aztecs were extremely civilized. They had their own cities. They had gold. They had things that were very advantageous for the Europeans. And unfortunately, we have an experience called Noche Triste, which is when the Aztecs attacked the Spanish, tried to drive the Spanish away, and then Cortez counterattacks. And what the Spanish do have on their side again is this disease. It wipes out many of the Native Americans. We do see a total change in their relationship. The Spanish are not going away. They overtake this civilization and really try to focus here on spreading the religion. If you remember anything about Ferdinand and Isabella, they had come into Spain as part of the Reconquista and retake Spain from the Muslims, and they want to spread that Catholicism more. Given the Protestant Reformation that we'll talk about with the English, they want to solidify Catholicism as important. So they want to force that on the Native Americans. And so the Spanish really stay there. We have some intermarriage, especially since mostly men are coming with the Spanish as conquistadores, and leading to a whole new class of people, the mestizos. They are a mix between Native and European heritage. It's a different experience than what we're going to see when we do talk about English America, because that's not what the English were intending to do. They didn't come into these civilizations. They really didn't try to spread Christianity too much. While the Spanish were very committed to spreading Catholicism, the English didn't want to intermix with the Native Americans. And this is a big question. It was actually one of the short answers on the exam this year, was to compare those two. So you can see here that the Spanish did not just stay limited to where they were. They go into St. Augustine, which is in Florida. That's the oldest settlement in North America today, or the present-day United States today. We see some other Spanish explorers going north as well, and Christianity, Catholicism especially, is their focus. And you can see that there is some backlash, because the natives, while they didn't have what we might consider an organized religion, they did have religion. And so they do try to fight back, but it's too difficult. They have too many things that are working against them, which I'll talk about in a second. The disease, the disorganization, once they do start to lose their numbers, just start to fall apart. And so many of the Spanish that are there, the priests do come as well. You'll see beautiful missions and churches and things like that in California, if you ever have a chance to go out there, in Mexico and places like that, because religion was such a hallmark. Now, what this has left behind is we focus a lot on the negative aspects of the Europeans, especially the Spanish here, coming in and really decimating civilizations. We didn't even touch on the Incas in Peru or the Mayans throughout Central America. Just in the example of the Aztecs, it really decimated that entire civilization. And so what that has developed is something that we call the Black Legend, that the conquistadores were only there to torture and kill natives. And it's true, they did that. We have records of that, and we don't want to make light of it, but we have to try to balance, where does this fit in with some cultural changes? Some introduction of religion might be positive, languages, laws, and things like that. And so one of the resources that I left for you to explore was just some other ideas on the Black Legend. There's an article linked in the discussion group to see, is it true? Is the Black Legend true? Are we making too much? Are we not emphasizing enough on what the Spanish did? And so these three places are some alternative approaches. One thing that I like a lot here is John Green. I'm sure you've heard of John Green before. He has a whole series on U.S. history. He goes very fast, faster than I'm talking right now. And it's a good review, but it's something for you to watch and kind of get a different perspective on the topic.